Sheriff has paid me the finest compliment I ever had. His comparison of me with my father. And I thank him. I thank all of you. And I thank my longtime friend Clark Goodwin for his gracious presentation. He has meant so much to Dot Helms and me down through the years, and he is certainly a highly respected mover and shaker of my hometown of Monroe. Clark's father and my father were devoted friends, and had it not been for Clark himself, I'm not at all certain that the Helms Center would ever have gotten off the ground. He's a former chairman of the board, the first of the chairman of the foundation, as a matter of fact, and he guided and directed the center in its infancy, and he's always there when needed, which has been often, and I guess it still always will be. And I might add, as a personal and meaningful note to me, and when I tell you what it is, you'll understand, Mrs. Clark Goodwin is the daughter of one of my college roommates, Harrison Freeman, now retired from the practice of medicine, and what a great guy he was and is. I know that all of us tonight join in an expression of sympathy to the distinguished president of the university in the death of his father. He is referred to as his stepfather, but he was in fact and in reality the father of one of the great university presidents of this country. Now then, ladies and gentlemen, in every way, Bill Bennett is recognized from coast to coast as a distinguished, genuine, moral, spiritual, and yes, effective leader of this country. So is his remarkable and lovely wife, Elaine. And if I may presume to do so, I wish Elaine would stand up so we could say hello to her. Millions of Americans are guided and inspired by Bill and Elaine, and the two are inseparable in terms of a lot of things, including what they mean to this country. Neither has ever sugarcoated the truth, and neither approaches the problems of America today with timidity nor in a holier-than-thou way. Now let me say this as flat out and plainly as I can. There are no two other Americans anywhere who are doing more than Bill and Elaine Bennett to restore the moral and spiritual principles of this country. It's significant, you know, that so many North Carolinians regard Bill and Elaine as home folks. It's a measurement of the admiration in which they are held. And I sort of sense that they like North Carolina. Of course, Elaine is a native of North Carolina. But when they decided to acquire a second home, they chose Bald Head Island on North Carolina's coast, and that's where we picked up Bill today. Someone commented upon hearing that Bill and Elaine would be here tonight, paid the tribute to Bill that nobody should be surprised to learn that a man smart enough to earn a degree in philosophy at Williams College and a doctorate in political philosophy from the University of Texas and a law degree from Harvard would naturally want to have a second home in southeastern North Carolina. He is, and has been for a very long time, respected by America's leadership. I know how much affection and respect Ronald Reagan held for this great man. I will not take the time to tell about it, but he knows what I'm talking about. And that's why Mr. Reagan chose Bill Bennett to serve as chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and later as Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Education, and after that as President Bush's director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. I might add parenthetically that Bill's smartest move was to convince Elaine Bennett, whom many of you know and remember as Elaine Glover, to be his wife and the mother of his children. I'm talking about Elaine because she deserves equal billing and dual billing. She attended Myers Park High School in Charlotte. She met Bill during his years as director of the National Humanities Center in Durham, or the Research Triangle Park. Many of Elaine's family and friends are here tonight, and it's my pleasure to extend a special welcome to them too. But talk about a real doer. My father used to say that there were two kinds of people, talkers and doers. These are doers, Elaine and Bill. In 1987, Elaine Bennett founded an organization called Best Friends International. This outstanding organization, which reached more than 3,000 teenage girls in 22 cities in 13 states, including, I might add, a group of youngsters in Charlotte. This organization provides mentors for young girls from the 5th grade through graduation who are at an especially high risk for teenage pregnancy or drug use or both. Now, a recent study of Best Friends participants in the Washington, D.C. area found that only 5% of those young people were sexually active by age 15, compared with a staggering and horrifying, I guess is a better word, 63% of their peers elsewhere. Perhaps that is why best friends, girls, were 20 times less likely to become pregnant by high school graduation than the average female high school student in Washington, D.C. The Best Friends program, after 11 years of operation, boasts a 100% graduation rate. And how do you like that? I do not apologize for taking a little time to present Bill and Elaine, but Bill Bennett is one of the most admired Americans among members of my family, but so is Elaine. And as you hear Bill Bennett tonight, consider the possibility for the betterment of our nation if Elaine Bennett should one day become the First Lady of the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Dr. Bill Bennett.
Sir, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Helms, Mrs. Helms, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, Sheriff, that was a great presentation. You don't know how much we need a sheriff in Washington, D.C. Especially one with a key to a jail. Go back and make an arrest, Senator. I'll take care of the lawyer, you take care of We could have a little fun, can't we? Thank you. Well, I was delighted that Senator Helms mentioned my wife. I was very considerate. I was, by the end, just hoping for something like equal time. And what he said, of course, was absolutely true. And the business about Williams and Harvard and Texas and all those degrees, that didn't make me smart enough to buy a house in southeast North Carolina. Somewhere, my mama or grandma's good sense made me sensible enough to marry a girl from North Carolina who had the sense to buy a house in southeast North Carolina and tell me how to get it. We call it the house that virtue built. And we love it. And I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be in North Carolina. I'm always pleased to be in North Carolina. I'm an adopted North Carolinian. The good Lord doesn't allow us to pick the states we're born in, but we can have some freedom in where we locate and where we spend our time. And Elaine and I do choose to spend as much time as we can in this wonderful state of North Carolina with her family, now my family, friends and relatives, and it's a delight to be back. We do miss signals once in a while. I'm from New York, Brooklyn, and Lane is from Charlotte, North Carolina. So when we got married, it was a little different. I introduced her to my relatives, two people, and she introduced me to several hundred people, all of whom are my cousins. And it's hard in my family, too, because we're not on speaking terms with some of the two people. So it gets even... I'm only going to do this about 3 or 4 more times, and then I'll be done with it. But it always is a pleasure to be here, and we love coming to North Carolina. It was a blind date. Everybody wants to know how we met. We met on a blind date in Chapel Hill. And Elaine heard I was a Yankee philosophy professor, and so she drove her own car out because she said to a friend of hers, if he says anything insulting about North Carolina, I'm leaving and driving back home immediately. And I laid eyes on her, and I never have said anything negative about North Carolina ever since. Jesse Helms, you are a national hero. You are a national resource. Judge Learned Hands spoke once in one of his books of men whom nothing can daunt and nothing can bribe, and that is Senator Jesse Helms. In a town of waverers, people who shift with the wind, who adjust their sails to the prevailing political winds, it is good to have a man who is always setting forth in the right direction. Helms and Reagan are a lot alike. I heard Edmund Morris, Reagan's biographer, the other night on television say that Reagan and Helms is like an aircraft carrier in the ocean. Those old movies, you see, Victory at Sea, those old World War II movies, those aircraft carriers going, the wind and the waves and everything is turbulent, but they just keep going right in the direction they are aimed. Unlike other politicians who are more like chips on the ocean being tossed this way and that. I have a lot of Jesse Helms stories. I could fill the evening with them. I'll just tell you one because a reporter asked me once, seeking to embarrass me, he said, I understand you're close with Senator Helms. And I said, yes, I am. He said, will you frankly admit it? I said, yes, I frankly admit it. I admit to my friendships in public, and I'm proud to do so. We talked for a while, and then I said, let me tell you the kind of thing that Jesse Helms stands for. And I mentioned fear of the Lord and a man who attempts to walk in the ways of the Lord. And then I mentioned a man whose patriotism is palpable. You can see it, you can feel it in most everything he says and does. A man whose dedication to his family and to the idea of family and the idea of decency and standards, all of these things define Jesse Helms. And then I came out with 3 quotes along those lines, one on the role of faith in this republic, one on patriotism, and one on family. And he said, yeah, that sounds like old Jesse Helms. I didn't know you were associated with that, but that sounds like old Jesse Helms. I said, well, actually, I fooled you. That's not from Jesse Helms. It's from a liberal from Massachusetts. And this guy looked at me in shock and said, Teddy Kennedy? I said, no, not Teddy Kennedy, not that liberal from Massachusetts. John Adams, that liberal from Massachusetts. We have come a long way in this country, and not all of it is good. But there are still some people who understand what it's all about, and this is one of them. It's an honor to be here with you, sir. Senator Helms told you how I came to Washington, I did start as chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I want to stress this was National Endowment for the Humanities, not the National Endowment for the Arts. I want to be very clear about that one. The arts is the one with the pictures. Sometimes dirty pictures. Humanities is the one with the books. They're sometimes dirty too, but you have to be a professor to know how dirty they are. After I was approved by the Senate, we served in office. It took Ronald Reagan a year to name a candidate for chairman. They told Ronald Reagan he had to have a professor of the humanities run this organization, so they began a nationwide search to find a professor of the humanities who had voted for Ronald Reagan. There were 3 of us in the country, and I was the biggest, so I got the job. There was a lot of black tie things at the National Gallery with lots of people with phony accents and affected airs, lots of white wine and brie, lots of French. It was okay, but I didn't enjoy it particularly. My wife is much better at speaking with people at these events than I am. She is a naturally gregarious person who likes to talk to people, and people indeed like to talk to her. I, on the other hand, am not so gregarious. Our different approaches to social gatherings, receptions, and the like have been likened, as one person said, when Bill and Elaine go to a party, a group of people for Elaine is a receiving line, for Bill it's a power sweep. So we have a somewhat different approach. But we managed through that, and then I became Secretary of Education, as Senator Helms said. Ronald Reagan said to me, very simply, he said, I'm not sure I can get rid of this department, which I'd like to do, but since I can't, maybe you could make some sense out of education and talk for parents rather than for the educational interests. And so I said I'd try. Now, once again, my wife enters into the picture. When I got the job, she said, instead of just making pronouncements about what everybody ought to do, you ought to go out into the country, find out what's going on, and then make your pronouncements. Do your homework before you make pronouncements. I said, well, why should I do that? And nobody else in Washington does it that way. Why should I? She said, because you're a teacher, and you want to stress the importance of homework. So do your homework. I said, Elaine, I am the Secretary of Education of the United States. I don't do retail, I do wholesale. And she, the daughter of a very shrewd businessman, said, if you do good retail, you'll do better wholesale. So I went around the country. I have to tell you one quick story. I went to 110 schools on my wife's advice, teaching classes. And if you teach classes and you're the Secretary of Education, you not only teach the students and teachers and administrators, you also teach TV cameras, which are in the back of the room, so that if you make a mistake, as Dan Quayle can tell you, you might lead the evening news. I was at the Emma Kahn Elementary School in Raleigh, and I told the children a story about George Washington. They had never heard it before. I asked them whether it was a good thing or bad thing to grow old. And all of the children, all the 8-year-olds, said, it's a bad thing to grow old. And I said, why is it bad to grow old? They said, because you get grumpy, and you get creaky and grumpy, and other things. 8-year-olds say things like that, whether it's politically sound to do so or not, they say it. So they decided getting old was a bad thing. So I told them a story about George Washington. And I said, George Washington was trying to persuade his soldiers not to march on Philadelphia with their bayonets, to hold the Congress at bayonet point because they wanted their money for their service. And George Washington thought at the end of the war, this was a very bad precedent for the government, for the army to turn bayonets against the Congress, though it is understandable, isn't it, from time to time. So he was trying to persuade them, and he wasn't having much luck. Then he remembered a piece of paper, some notes that someone had given him. He put his hand in his pocket, picked it out, and with the other hand, he put on a pair of spectacles. He took his glasses out, put them on. None of his men had ever seen him with the spectacles. And there was silence in the room. And he said to the men, oh, I see that you're surprised to see that I wear spectacles. Well, gentlemen, I must tell you, I have not only become old and gray, I have become almost blind in the service of my country. And with those words, all opposition melted. Those words reminded his men of who he was, the kind of man he was, the kind of character he had, and so all resistance subsided. So I asked the kids again, the children again, is it a good thing or a bad thing to grow old? And they said, well, maybe it's a good thing. Maybe you can get better in the way George Washington got better. And so we talked about that. And I was an old philosopher. What I was doing was trying to get them to understand the difference between the natural good and the moral good. And that for a man, it's probably more important, I think we all believe in this room, it's more important that the moral good be right than that the natural good be right. We all grow old, but we can become better morally as we grow old. Well, the session was over. I thought it was a good lesson. I asked the children whether there were any questions, and a little boy raised his hand and said, you'll excuse my accent, I still don't have it right, but he said, Mr. Secretary, when y'all get together at meetings of the cupboard, and little girl leaned over and said, cabinet. And he said, oh yeah, cabinet meetings. Do y'all really eat Jelly Bellies? He'd heard about Ronald Reagan and jelly beans. Ronald Reagan liked jelly beans. And I said, look, I just told you about George Washington. I cannot tell a lie. I said, Ronald Reagan has a bowl of jelly beans in front of him at cabinet meetings. I said, he'll have a couple, pass them around. People take them. I've had a few. The little boy said, you've had more than a few, Mr. Secretary. And that same little girl said, you look like you've had them all, Mr. Secretary. Well, I came back, I told Ronald Reagan, Gorbachev was touring the United States at the time. Now, you might think I was a little sassy of those kids, and I guess it was a little sassy, but it was clever. American wit, freedom. I told Ronald Reagan, I said, Gorbachev wants to find out what a free country is. He needs to go to that third grade classroom in Macon. See, you don't talk that way to the Russian Minister of Education. No one ever had in the history of the evil empire. Anyway, it was a wonderful job. I loved it. We went to 110 schools on my wife's advice. She got me started traveling, and then she said I travel too much, and we're still having that discussion. But it was great, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about American education. We went to universities. I had to go to Stanford. I had to go to Harvard and talk about problems in their curriculum. I had to go to Stanford to defend Western civilization. Somebody had to do it. So they said, why not Reagan, Secretary of Education? The argument being made against it was being made by Jesse Jackson and a group of students who occupied the president's office. They chanted, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And they asked me what I thought of that, and I said I thought it was catchy but not compelling as an argument. So we talked about that, but it was a lot of fun. It was a great and enjoyable job. When I left that job 3 years, I did that job for 3 years, and then as the Reagan administration wound to a close, I left. I was out for 3 or 4 months, and then George Bush asked me to come back in as drug czar. I was the nation's first drug czar, or director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy. That's why they call me drug czar. I had no laugh lines in that job, except as drug czar I could refer to Elaine as Zarling. And to our 2 little boys as the Zardines. Our boys who are still wearing Carolina blue today. And I will not rush through my remarks. There's no particular reason to, is there? Hard to know how to interpret that applause. There are obviously a lot of Utah fans here. No, I'm just kidding. But that was the most gripping and engaging of the jobs. We did that same way we did the education job. Went to 110 cities, went to where the problem was the worst, and we saw some pretty bad stuff. But those were the days in which this United States of America, its people, its government, its president, its cabinet took the drug issue seriously. And things happened. Drug use went down from 1985 to 1992 by 60% in this country, because it was attacked on all fronts. It was attacked as a plague on our children. It was attacked as a moral wrong. It was attacked by law enforcement. It was attacked in the schools. You couldn't go into a school without seeing the posters, and it's hard to find a lot of those posters now. People made fun of Nancy Reagan for saying, "Just say no," but the kids didn't make fun of her. They heard it and they took it in. And drug use went down by 60% from 1985 to 92. Those were the golden age. That was the golden age. Those were the great years. You couldn't put on TV without seeing an anti-drug message. And what do we have now? Almost silence on this issue from this administration. Tobacco's to be run out of the country, run out of every land in the world by this administration. All of this against tobacco, and not a word about the legalization of drug movement and what's going on in this country. Not a word about narcotics, about marijuana, about heroin, about LSD, about cocaine, and it is tripling. The use of those drugs is tripling among our 8th graders right now. We are seeing the fastest increase in drug use among 12 and 13-year-olds we have ever seen, and we do not hear a word. What we hear instead is how much more can they grind the tobacco makers. Well, they don't have their priorities right. They don't have it square and clear as they should. It was a great job. It was a gripping job. It's my only real deep professional regret. I left that job too soon. I thought we had things in pretty good shape. I did not know what would happen after I left. If I had to do it over again, I would not leave it. But things kind of fell apart. The country sort of lost interest in the problem generally. People thought things were getting better. And so now we've lost control of a lot of that problem. We have to redirect our energies on that issue. There are international dimensions, there are national dimensions. We know what to do, we know what works. We can do more. Well, after that career in Washington, 9 years, remember starting at National Endowment for the Humanities in black tie, listening to people drop French literary allusions and eating brie and drinking white wine, and ending up in drug busts in Cartagena, Colombia, watching the cartels be taken down by the Colombian intelligence operation. My wife thought, Elaine thought, your career has been very exciting, but it's kind of been a case study in downward mobility. Things are getting worse all the time. She didn't really, but it was a joke. And she said, "What's next, dear? Toxic and hazardous waste cleanup?" And I said, "No, George Bush wants me to be chairman of the Republican Party." Close enough. But I went out and into the real world, into the private sector, and one of the things I wanted to do was to write a book. And this is the heart of my remarks. I'm trying to give you a sense of what I think and believe through this kind of biography or autobiography. And one of the things I decided to do was to do a book based on what I had learned in the field, based on my wife's good advice to get out into the field. And after 220 visits to schools, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, colleges, to jails, to reform schools, to penitentiaries, to drug treatment centers, to inner city streets, to public housing projects, to Peru, to Colombia, to lots of places, to crack houses, to hospitals. There was a funny kind of convergence of the issues. And what I was hearing from adults, responsible adults in all the places I visited in 2 jobs, which if you think about it should be very different jobs. Shouldn't they be? Shouldn't the Secretary of Education's job be very different from the drug czar's job in terms of subject matter, in terms of the kinds of things you're dealing with? Turned out there was an awful lot of overlap. And what I heard from responsible adults in both jobs and the visits in both jobs was essentially the same thing. Who's teaching the children? Who's teaching the basics? What's happening to our country? Have we lost our guardrails? What's going on? Are we losing this great republic? Who's doing the basic instruction? Where are kids getting their ideas of how to behave and how to act? One hardly has to think about that very long today without seeing the same questions are being raised by the news or what's in the papers. What about character? What about basic orientation and the ideas of right and wrong and good and evil? What deserves to be defended? What deserves to be loved? What deserves to be avoided? Teachers in the school said, I'd ask them, what are you doing about the education of character? And they'd say, well, that George Washington story was nice, but we're not sure how we should teach these children because we have so many different kinds of children, so many different backgrounds. And I said, do you have children who come from backgrounds where boys like to be beat up, where girls like to be grabbed against their will? Fundamentals of morality. Do you know any cultures where that's true? No, no one knew any cultures. No one had any kids where the kids like to have their lunch money stolen or like to be beat up after school or be made fun of. We're told that they're stupid. I said, well, there are common values. There really are. The basic teachings of my faith, Christian, I'm a Catholic, really now have spread around the world. And many religions agree on these things. We can make sense of this. And we can teach these things to our children. Indeed, our founders thought it was imperative that we teach these things to our children. They said, well, what material should we use? I said, virtually all of civilization, all of history, all of literature, all of religion. That beautiful Gaelic a poem we just heard at the beginning would be a good start. So I put together a set of materials. And it was for teachers, and it was for others, and it was a set of stories and poems. A colleague of mine from the Department of Education went to the Library of Congress, Xeroxed about 11 feet of stories and poems, put it together, turned it into a book, called it The Book of Virtues. Well, had some trouble selling the idea to publishers. First publisher looked at the material and said, it's 800 pages here. There's no sex. There are no pictures. Who will buy this book? I said, well, there is precedent, Not to compare my modest little effort, but there are some very great books without pictures. Some of the best. The second publisher said, well, I like your Book of Values. I said, it's not the Book of Values. Book of Values is the Sears catalog. Book of Values is, Walmart. This is the Book of Virtues. I said, what's that? I said, virtue is excellence as a human being, excellence as a moral and spiritual creature. So that's an interesting new idea. Interesting idea, not a new one. But anyway, I said, I'm going to push ahead, do it. Kept trying. Finally got a publisher. They printed 50,000 copies, and they hoped they'd sell them all. We have now sold about 3 million copies of this book, which is which has been a wonderful thing for us, for Zarling, for the Zardines. I hope for the Grand Zardines, for various activities on Bald Head Island, for Catholic Charities. We have given so much money to Catholic Charities. I have 4 get out of purgatory free passes, so I'm hoping. I digress for a moment. Throughout my government career, I have a big brother. Well, I had a big brother before that, but I've had a big brother all my life who was a wonderful big brother. When my parents were divorced at an early age, this big brother had a lot to do with helping me along, looking out for me. He said, I don't know if Senator Helms knows this story, but when I was in college, I was pretty radical. I was pretty liberal. And I was hanging out with some students from a left-wing group called Students for a Democratic Society. Yes. Hanging out. I was 19 years old. And I called my brother. He was kind of a father figure. And I said, thinking maybe of joining. And he said, I wouldn't do that. I said, why? He said, well, I don't really think you'll agree with these people. It's not a really good organization. And the day may come when someone might ask you, you ever been a member of an organization like Students for Democratic Society? I said, I could not imagine the day coming when someone would ask me something like that. Can you, Senator Helms, imagine such a thing? My brother gave me good advice. I grew out of that. And it was good advice. He gave me a lot of good advice along the way. But during my government career, he kept saying to me, when are you going to get a real job? And I said, Chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities, Secretary of Education, drug czar, those are real jobs. No, I need a real job. So I wanted to make that book work, so it'd be a success. So that seemed, but I got my revenge. I have to tell you this, because when it was announced that my brother had taken the case for Bill Clinton and was his lawyer, I called him up and I said, that's a real job. Uncle Bob is okay. We think he's gone a little far on this, but as Senator Helms and I were saying, he was a very good lawyer to the Senate Ethics Committee. He was a very good lawyer for Cap Weinberger, and we will bring him back to good causes as soon as we can get this thing wrapped up. Now, what I'm doing, and that's what I want to comment on just briefly, and then I welcome your questions. I really want to talk about what's on your mind. I'm working on several issues now. They are related, all related to the work I did in my government jobs, and it was my particular good fortune, my great good fortune, to have served two men I admire enormously, Ronald Reagan and George Bush, in very important jobs, and I learned so much from those jobs. And I'm continuing, or trying to continue, a lot of that work. Let me tell you what I'm working on now. First of all, in terms of the largest perspective, I don't know if you know, but there is a worldwide problem of Christian persecution. I do not know if you're aware of it. I was not aware of it until about a year ago. I did not know, did you know, that more Christians have been killed in this century than in the 19 preceding centuries? I had no idea this was true until I was educated about it. It's going on in the Sudan. It's going on in China. In the Sudan, Christians, once they are identified as Christians, are sold into slavery. There is a cardinal of my church, Catholic Church, a very distinguished man who comes to the United States twice a year seeking donations, which we try to give to him. We've given our family, others have. And with that money, he buys children out of slavery. Now, I've said to my friends, sometimes not our friends, often not our friends in Hollywood, you're always making movies about slavery. Hollywood loves to beat up on the South, loves to make yet just one more movie, hitting the South for its legacy of slavery. When, of course, as you know, as Martin Luther King said, he was much more afraid in Cicero, Illinois, than he was in Selma, Alabama. His greatest fear was those cities, not the South, in which he had grown up. Of course, the South had segregation. Of course, it had to change, and it did, and it has, and it is now in much better shape on racial issues than the state of Massachusetts. When I was Secretary of Education, we had 5 times as many complaints of racial discrimination out of Massachusetts than we had out of Georgia. It's a very interesting thing. In any case, all the drafting of the memory back in to talk about slavery. Well, there's slavery going on right now in the world. And Christians and non-Christians, Americans, need to rally to this cause. There's a lot going on. There's a piece of legislation in the House and the Senate. But what it needs more than anything else is attention. Attention must be paid. We may have to make a decision about increasing or decreasing trade with China, or increasing and decreasing trade with the Sudan because of these policies, and it seems to me we ought to. That is, we ought to be prepared to make something of an economic sacrifice for the sake of fundamental human rights. And if a country says it will persecute people because they believe in the cross, it seems to me the people of this country ought to be able to stand up for it. I'm going in January to China, never been. I'm going with Chuck Colson, who's invited me to join him and a group of other people, and I very much look forward to the trip. Religious liberty is at peril in our time, and I urge you to pay attention to it and to support those who are trying to do something about it. I'm still very active in the drug issue. I'm co-chairman of the Partnership for Drug-Free America. Those were the people who made those ads years ago, the 2 eggs in the frying pan, the person jumping off the diving board into the empty swimming pool. I serve with Mario Cuomo, who's the other co-chair. We're not arguing. We work together on this issue, and we've made a new set of ads, and some of them are very, very effective. Yesterday or the day before, Carol O'Connor, the famous actor, spoke before a Senate committee on drugs, and he's in one of our ads, and he makes one of the most effective pleas I've ever heard. He lost a son to the drug problem, and he says, get between your children and drugs any way you can. This is still a very serious problem in this country. As I said, use is exploding among 12 and 13-year-olds who now believe, as they did 15 years ago, that drugs are harmless. They are not. They are much more harmful, in fact, than the drugs we saw 25 or 30 years ago. I am as supportive as I can be of my wife's work. She works in arguably the knottiest, hardest problem, and maybe the most critical problem of American society, the breakdown of the family identified in her context as teenage pregnancy and illegitimacy, and that she is having such profound success is a tribute to her and her efforts, and also to a belief in these young girls, a belief in what is possible, creating for them notions of what it means to be a young woman that they had not thought of because no one had put it in their path. Harassed by a lot of boys, groped at by a lot of boys, jumped from behind by a lot of boys. These girls wonder whether they have any allies. In Elaine Bennett, they have an ally, and she has enlisted other people, Alma Powell, the wife of Colin Powell, and others, to assist her. It's a wonderful thing. It works, and it really does encourage you about life generally. It's not just a say no program. The girls get to do a lot of things. Elaine takes them out to Ford's Theater. They have aerobics. They go for a day and get their hair done, their nails done. They understand, or are taught to understand, a different conception of themselves than they get from the boys who are grabbing at them and what they see on television and in the movies. And it's very, very important, and I am very, very proud of her work and her sister's work, who's with us tonight, who runs the program in Charlotte. In a broader sense, the education issue persists in the United States. We are not where we should be. This Thursday, when I get back to Washington, I get back Wednesday, I have a meeting on the Hill on drugs, and on Thursday we're having a conference on the drug issue, or Friday actually, on the education issue. Because 15 years after A Nation at Risk, you remember that report in 1983, we are not as far along as we should be by any measure. An international assessment of our kids, our high school seniors, against high school seniors from other industrialized nations, put our kids, our students, last or next to last or next to next to last. We finished at the bottom in virtually everything. And the Asians didn't even participate in this particular exam. We were ahead of Cyprus and behind everybody else in math and science. Though, in one other exam, when our students were asked how they thought they were doing in math, we had more self-esteem about our math than did any other nation. American kids thought they knew a lot and knew the least, and the kids from other countries didn't think they knew much and knew more. This is intolerable. This is impossible. We cannot continue to be the kind of country we want to be and provide the opportunity for our children with these kinds of standards of expectation. A friend of mine who runs a major company in the Silicon Valley says the problem's easy. We'll just keep immigration going. 40% of the chief executives in the Silicon Valley are from other nations. Immigration is fine. I believe in immigration. But is immigration an answer? Because we have failed to provide an education to our own children, so we must open the gates to let more people in from other countries, so we will have people competent to run these countries? Impossible. Impossible. At George Washington University, I read in the paper the other day in Washington, D.C., there are 36 graduate students in chemistry. Not one of them was born in the United States. We have to front load our math and science in the teaching of our children. It's critical, and we will be making some recommendations about those issues. Two other things, and then I'm done, and then I welcome your questions. The culture, in the broadest sense. Last week, Senator Joseph Lieberman, a colleague of Senator Helms, a Democrat, somewhat liberal Democrat from Connecticut, and I presented the first Silver Sewer Award to the Seagram's Company. We plan to make these presentations 2 or 3 times a year, and it is a sewer cover, a manhole cover, which we've painted silver and put dollar signs on, to that Hollywood company which seeks to make profit on the souls of children. That is, we plan to hold up for public ridicule and condemnation those companies which are destroying the innocence of the American child through music, through television shows, and through movies. And we will do it persistently until we have success. The destruction of the innocence of the young is, I think, one of the great crimes of American life right now. Childhood is a short period of time. We ought to be able to preserve our children in that innocence for a little bit longer. We should not be showing them the worst sides of human life and the worst sides of human nature, which leads me to my conclusion. There's an issue, the place in the front pages of American politics right now, the American national story, which cannot be ignored. And that is the issue of the presidency of the United States and the man who occupies that office. In my view, the situation is the following. I believe that this man, William Jefferson Clinton, is a man whom I do not start with any bias against. I kind of liked him as a governor. When I was Secretary of Education, I worked with 4 governors very closely. Bob Graham of Florida, Democrat; Bill Clinton, Democrat from Arkansas; Lamar Alexander of Tennessee; and Bruce Babbitt, another Democrat from Arizona. I thought Clinton was bright, alert, had good ideas, wanted to do some interesting things in terms of standards, wanted to test his teachers, and was interested in educational choice. Not interested in those ideas anymore. Promising, bright, politically as adept as anyone on the scene. But he has now brought disgrace to the office of the President of the United States. You have to disbelieve an awful lot of people in order to believe Bill Clinton. These are facts. These aren't opinions. You simply have to disbelieve the testimony, the depositions, the sworn statements of 9 or 10 women in order to disbelieve Bill Clinton. That's point one. Point two, Bill Clinton has promised us he would come forward and give a full explanation of what occurred between him and the intern, Monica Lewinsky. He has done nothing and said nothing. He has stonewalled. As I have been saying from day one, if he has nothing to hide, why is he hiding? There is no... There is no reason, legal or otherwise, why an innocent man cannot step forward and explain everything to everyone's satisfaction. Yell it from the rooftops, and that's what an innocent man, a man with nothing to hide, would do. Instead, we are getting a pattern of delay, of obfuscation, of inconsistency. When asked about whether he remembered seeing Kathleen Willey in his office, he said no, and then the next time he was asked after 60 Minutes, he remembered vividly in every detail what he did not do. When asked whether there were any documents connected with that case, no, there were no documents connected with that case, but the day after 60 Minutes, all of the media were treated to a flood of documents on that case. What was a young intern doing coming 37 times to the White House? What was she doing being squired around by Vernon Jordan, having lunch with Bill Richardson from the United Nations? What are we doing when a goon squad is sent out from the White House, told to smear the independent counsel and all his people? What is going on? What kind of a country is going on? Why can't these people call a stop to it? And why won't the American people call a stop to it? Listen, my frustration about this is greatest, frankly, right now in regard to the American people. The founders knew from time to time we would get a lemon, a knave, a rogue, maybe a tyrant, but they pretty much thought we wouldn't get a tyrant, but we would get all sorts of people who weren't fit for the job. They'd get in somehow anyway. But they never thought that we would be complicit. We would be complicit in the injury they were doing to the country. The American people are now coming dangerously close to being complicit in their own corruption. And that is a very dangerous and very frightening thing. The public is simply not paying attention to the evidence which is right before it, and a self-respecting people should not stand for what is going on now. The American people see it for what it is, but they still have not been able to bring themselves to say it. Two last points about this. And I say this not with any political motivation. This is a concern about our country and about the presidency, the office of the presidency. You had Madeleine Albright speak here last year. She went out to the forum in Columbus, Ohio, with Samuel Berger and with Secretary Cohen to discuss our policies in Iraq. But they went because the president could not go. The president could not go and participate in an open forum. He could not participate in an open forum because of the questions he would have been asked in an open forum. This is the problem. And finally, if you will, and although it almost seems absurd, I watched a little bit of the Academy Awards presentation, a week ago, 2 weeks ago? Some of you see it? There was one joke by the MC, Billy Crystal, who's a very funny man. He said, last year, President Clinton said there was too much sex in Hollywood. Now, folks, when Hollywood can make a joke about you, when they have the high ground, and he can turn it around and say, too much sex in Hollywood? How about in Washington? When you give Hollywood the high ground, folks, you're on awfully low ground indeed. This is our country. The people who put it together hoped that the conditions of mankind would improve because of this new foundation and Charter of Liberty. They hoped things would improve for us materially. They hoped things would improve for us politically. But for them, they never praised the society they were putting together because it would lead to a society of abundance. They did not have in mind hitting 9,000 or 10,000 on the Dow, though they would have been delighted to see it. What they thought, as John Adams, your predecessor, Mr. Helms, said, was that this would be a republic of free and good men. They hoped and they understood that the only test of a regime, the kind of regime they were putting together, was not what the Dow would hit, not how much money we'd make, not how good we'd feel about ourselves, but they said the test of this republic is the kind of men we produce, the kind of human beings that our ancestors, our descendants rather, come to be. That was the test for them. And so, like George Washington with the glasses, and the John Adams I quoted earlier, they did things like pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. And they meant it. It wasn't rhetorical. It wasn't just politically correct. It wasn't because they thought it was a crowd pleaser. They meant it. And you know they meant it because after they signed the documents, the death warrants were out for all of them. That is the country they bequeathed to us, and that is still our country to claim if we have and still possess the real secret of democracy, as Pericles put it. The secret of democracy, he said in Athens, and it's still true for America. It was then, it is now. The secret is courage. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dr. Bennett, our audience has submitted several questions here, and we've tried to, actually they submitted a lot more than several, but we're going to try to get through at least two here. This is from Christina Kakadelis from South Mecklenburg High School. My dog just had puppies, and I told my principal that they were Democrats because their eyes were closed. That's pretty good. How do you feel about this? Do you think that they will become Republicans when their eyes open?
Well, if you raise them well. Look. Good for South Mecklenburg. Let's hear it for South Mecklenburg. Look, what's missing in the Democratic Party? Let me tell you something. I watched, with some agony, Watergate. But as this stuff unfolded, I said, well, we can't have this. We can't have this. I watched poor Bob Packwood, get hit and beaten up. But then when I found out what Bob Packwood was up to, I said, well, that just probably has to be. I thought it was very tough, but I thought we had to have the inquiry on Gingrich because it is a nation of laws. It is not a nation of men. We have to have due process. We have to have these procedures. We have to have civic confidence. During Watergate, Some Republicans stepped forward and said some of the same things, and eventually all did. My argument with the Democratic Party now, and I'm a former Democrat, is where is the Democrat who will step forward and call for an end to this? I've been calling a few of them up on the phone, a few that I know, and saying, you know, where's the Nathan to Bill Clinton's David? This is an audience that will know what I'm talking about. Nathan says to David, after David and Bathsheba, he goes to him and says, you know, you can't do this. He tells him a story. First, he traps him. But says to the king, you cannot behave like this. I have said to a couple of senior Democrat people, whom I have great admiration, I won't tell you who they were, but people like Moynihan and Lieberman, but I'm not going to tell you who they are. And Dick Riley from South Carolina, you have the stature, you have the friendship, you go to this man and you say, I'm not your lawyer, I'm not your spinmeister, I'm not your pollster, I'm not your pundit. You have a responsibility not just to defend your bottom, not just to get your polls up. You have a responsibility to the people of the United States to tell them the truth. And if you cannot tell them the truth, then it's time to go. Where is that Democrat? And I'm going to call Bill Bradley and Sam Nunn on Thursday and do the same thing, because that party runs the risk of being seen as condoning everything that's going on here. And that's impossible for that party. And there ought to be someone with the wit and the sense and the courage to step forward. Though to date, I haven't seen anyone. Frank Boren, the retired senator from Oklahoma, I saw on television, he made some, I thought, very, very thoughtful statements. I'm not talking about condemnation. I'm not talking about calling for resignation. If the man can't explain himself, he should resign. Or if explaining it will lead to such great condemnation by the American people, then he should resign. What I'm calling is for a full accounting and a full airing to put this behind us. Well, the White House has been saying, we want to put it behind us. It's a great distraction. And so the White House, which now wants to put it behind us, has claimed executive privilege, which is not only frivolous on its face, but which is sure to delay things even further. I take no pleasure in this. I take no pleasure in a Democratic Party that does not seem to have one voice who can step forward and say, let us have integrity in this process. And that's a shame. That's a shame. Good luck with the puppies.
How will we be able to tell when family values are restored?
How will we be able to tell if family values are restored? Well, that's a very good question. What you've got in America right now, of course, is a lot of very good and strong and healthy families. But you've also got a situation in which it is no longer what it was. It is no longer normative. It is no longer regarded as normative that a family stay together, that a family be mutually supportive, and that the destruction or breakup of a family is regarded as a grievous and serious and very, very sad thing. And that lost understanding, that shift in understanding that has taken place in the last 15 or 20 years is what needs to be corrected. Let me tell you a very interesting thing. The Yankelovich people who do these surveys, they do the largest surveys in the country, they use the largest number of people, pointed out the following. In 1951, 85% of the American people, when asked the question, should parents stay together for the sake of their children, even if they are having difficulties, even serious difficulties? 85% of the American people who were asked that answered yes in 1951. In 1985, 46% answered yes. Now, you may think that's progress. Most people don't think that's progress. But whatever it is, it's a sea change. It is a dramatic sea change. What's going on here? It's a shift in the culture. Not a shift in the economy, not a shift in the Pentagon, not a shift even in foreign policy, as critical as that is. It's a shift in the internal system. It's a shift in internal beliefs and values and norms and mores. What brought it about? Freedom, license, affluence, democracy, excess, and as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, and I think he put it exactly right, the spiritual axis of life growing dim. When men no longer think of themselves as creatures made in the image of God, as moral and spiritual beings, but as something else, then things change. Consider the form of the argument today. Who cares what's going on? Who cares what the leader does, as long as we're making money and we've got 24-hour programming? Sell that argument to Thomas Jefferson. Tell George Washington that's how you're interpreting his legacy. Go see old John Adams and say, you know, you were worried that, unrestrained, as John Adams said, human desires will break the cords of the Constitution like a whale goes through a net. Go tell John Adams, well, we see it differently now, Mr. Adams. We're going to hit 9,000 on the Dow. Everybody's having a good time. Everybody's investing, making a lot. Why end the party? John Adams wrote in one of his letters to his wife, one of the great marriages of all time, John and Abigail Adams. He wrote to her, "The American people, unlike people before, have a right to the most envied and dreaded of knowledge, the knowledge of the character of their rulers. And they will make a determination whether the trust they have reposed in those rulers deserves to be continued, or if that trust has been wantonly trifled away." Nice phrase. Wantonly trifled away. And if it has, it belongs to the people of the United States to remove that trust. These were people who thought in terms of what we call today, in a very unsatisfactory word, values. They truly believed the things they wrote. We are at one of those critical crossroads where we are going to determine for the future and for the children who are watching this drama unfold the kind of people we are. How we answer those questions, and some of them are quite imminent, will have a lot to do with the future of the American family. A family, more than anything else, is based on trust, on promise, on commitment, and on fidelity. And if children see their parents saying, well, yes, but we got a heck of a party going on, so maybe those things don't matter as much as before, then the future of the family is in peril. But don't ever, ever give up on the United States of America. We have conquered and fought and conquered Nazism, communism, the Great Depression, slavery. We overcame a civil war. We can overcome this. The American capacity for self-renewal. We are uniquely blessed, and I think we will be blessed again.
Mrs. Bennett, would you come up, please? It'll take you a minute to come around. Thank you both, Dr. and Mrs. Bennett, for your strong voice in favor of a return to traditional values and virtuous living. Your message needs to be heard in every corner of our country. We're challenged by your remarks tonight, and since we know that North Carolina is very much your adopted second home now, we'd like for you to take a reminder of the bounty of the Tar Heel State back to the Capitol with you as an expression of our appreciation of your fine work and your presence here this evening.
Yes.